This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and we're continuing Core Set 2020 Limited Set Review Week on my channel, talking about black today. We talked about white and blue already. We'll talk about red and green and multicolored and all that stuff over the next few days. Before we get started looking at all the black cards in the set, I want to remind you that I use a grading system that uses letter grades. You can find what those grades mean in the description below. Alright, now let's look at our first black card, which is Agonizing Siphon, which for 3 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says it deals 3 damage to any target, and you gain 3 life. This is not very efficient, and at sorcery speed it is super clunky, and I think that keeps it from being considered removal we would think of as premium. It can kill small stuff and go to your opponent's dome when you need it to, and having life gain attached to that is a nice bonus that does make up at least a little bit for the fact that it isn't very efficient. In other words, the fact that you have to potentially use a whole turn to use it is certainly less of a problem if you're gaining life. Still, it does fall short of premium, and that means it is not first pickable, but it is the kind of black removal you'll feel fine about picking up once you're already in black. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Audacious Thief, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 human rogue at common, and when it attacks, you draw a card and lose 1 life. Seems like a nice common. Sure, it doesn't do great in the vanilla test, but if you attack with it even once on a board where the best your opponent can do is trade, I think you'll be pretty happy. Even more so if your opponent chooses not to block at all, because then your card advantage will start to snowball. Obviously, if they do trade with it, you end up netting a 2-for-1. Now, there will be board states where you just can't attack with it, and it becomes a pretty mediocre blocker in those cases, and that holds it back a little bit, but I think you're still pretty happy to play a couple of these in most black decks. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Barony Vampire, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 vampire at common. Here is our typical D, a creature with mediocre stats who doesn't do anything other than have those mediocre stats. You'll play it if you really need a 3-drop, or maybe if you have Sora, who we'll see later, but most of the time, I think you hope you don't. That makes it a D. Next up, we've got Blade Brand, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant. Target creature gains Death Touch until end of turn. Draw a card. We just saw this card a couple of sets ago, and it did better than I expected it to. While it doesn't make a creature bigger so that it can always win the combat, it does make any creature trade for anything, and that would just be a bad 2-for-1 if it weren't for the fact that it also draws you a card. It also combos well with creatures who have abilities that let them damage things, since it means instant death for the creatures they damage, whether or not it's from combat. I still don't love this card. It's too situational to be something we even run one of in every black deck, but I think you do it often enough that it's a C-. Next up, we have Blight Beetle, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/1 uncommon insect. It's got protection from green, a returning mechanic that makes it so a creature can't be blocked, targeted, dealt damage, enchanted, or equipped by anything of the protected color, green in this case. Also says creatures your opponents control can't have +1/+1 counters put on them. This is weird. I like that there are a bunch of color-hating cards around in this set, but this one seems a lot weaker than most of them. Protection from green is nice, but on a 2-mana 1/1, it's nothing special. There are green cards in this set that do stuff with counters, and this shuts those down, but it's not a huge focus of the set. Your opponent really needs to be doing 2 things to make this worth bringing in from your sideboard: be in green, and have a few cards that put counters on stuff, and I don't think that will come up with regularity. I think it's an F as a main board card. There's just no way you can put this in your main deck, and a C- out of your sideboard. Next up, we've got Blood Burglar, who for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 vampire rogue at common, and as long as it's your turn, it has lifelink. What would I give this if it were a 2-mana 2/2 with lifelink? Probably a C. I don't think this is significantly worse than that. Sure, it can't block and gain you life, but that's not a huge downgrade. I think this is still just a C, a solid playable, a little bit of life gain synergy in this set. We'll see some later in this video. We saw some in white, but still probably just a C. Next up, we have Blood for Bones, which for 3 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery. It says as an additional cost to cast this spell, sack a creature, return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, then return another creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This is an interesting version of this type of effect. Basically, what you're getting here is some card selection, albeit in a very weird way. You give up Blood for Bones and a creature in play, that's 2 cards, and then you get 2 back from your graveyard. One of them comes directly to the battlefield, and that has potential to be particularly nice if your deck has some powerful bombs, and the other goes to your hand. In the end, you're trading 2 cards for 2 cards. Now, Where this can get a little better is in a world where you have creature tokens, so you aren't giving up 2 full cards, but this requires some setup, both in terms of what you have in play and what's in your graveyard, and I think that's asking a lot. It also means this is horrendous in your hand early, and while it gets better as the game goes on, finding an optimal situation to use this might be a bit of a challenge. I want to be sort of optimistic about this card because I think it's a cool design. I can see some decks playing it, but I think it's going to be easy to cut. I think it's a C- for now, but it is one of these cards where if I'm wrong about it, I think I'm going to be overrating it rather than underrating it. Next up, we have Blood-Soaked Altar, which for 4 generic and 2 black is an uncommon artifact. You can tap it, pay 2 life, discard a card, sack a creature, and what do you get for all of that? Well, you get a 5/5 Black Demon creature token with flying. You can only activate this ability anytime you could cast a sorcery. So this is another interesting design, back-to-back cards. Generally, this is going to give you card disadvantage. To use this the first time, you have to pay 6 mana, 2 life, discard a card, and sacrifice a creature. If you're keeping count, that's 3 cards to make a 5/5 flying token. That's not a good deal, but after that you don't have to pay any more mana, and that is at least somewhat intriguing. Still, you go down 2 cards every time you use this, and that's a real cost, but I think maybe making huge flying tokens might be worth it. All the more so if you're in a deck that has some creature tokens or maybe threaten effects that let you sacrifice your opponent's stuff. I see this as potentially a win condition for a control deck, but I don't think aggressive decks want it at all, and I think maybe control decks want something a little better than this. Still, I think you could probably do worse than having a win condition that turns out 5/5 flyers. I'm going to give this a C. Next up, we have Bloodthirsty Aerialist, which for 1 generic mana and 2 black is a 2/3 vampire rogue at uncommon. It's got flying, and whenever you gain life, you put a +1/+1 counter on Bloodthirsty Aerialist. This is really strong. A 3 mana 2/3 with flying, already like a solid C at least. In some formats, it would even be a C+. But then you add the fact that anytime you gain life and this thing gets bigger, black decks, I mean, we've already seen effects that gain you life in black. They can do it without a whole lot of effort. Pairing it with white and or with green, or both colors where you're going to be able to gain life. You really don't need that many ways to gain life for this to be really good. I mean, 4 or 5 will do it. And if you have repeatable ways to do it, well, it can get pretty ridiculous. But I don't think I want to give this a build around grade just because I don't think you have to try that hard to make it work. I think it'll work in any black deck, and I think it's one of the better uncommons in the set, especially for black. I think it is a B-. I think you first pick it in some weaker packs. Next up, we have Bone Splinters, which for 1 black mana is a common sorcery. It says as an additional cost to cast this spell, sack a creature, destroy target creature. We've seen this several times, and every time, it's pretty solid. You have to 2-for-1 yourself, but the fact that it lets you kill anything makes that worth it in many cases, since you can take down your opponent's bomb. Its value goes up in situations where you have creature tokens or creatures who give you value when they die, but I still think it's just a decent removal spell, the kind you play if you don't pick up some of the better ones that are out there. I think it's a C. Next up, we have Boneclad Necromancer, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 3/3 human wizard at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you may exile target creature card from a graveyard. If you do, you get a 2/2 black zombie creature token. I like this card. Obviously, you really don't want to be casting it when there are no cards in either graveyard, because he is a 5 mana 3/3, and that's a straight up F. However, I think usually by turn 5, it usually won't be a stretch to have a creature to exile. If this were a 5 mana for a 3/3 and a 2/2 100% of the time, I think it would be a B-. As it is, I am going to limit it to a C+, because there will be some ugly times when you just have to cast this where it will feel like an F. So yeah, C+. Next up, we have Cavalier of Night, which for 2 generic and 3 black is a 4/5 elemental knight at Mythic Rare. It's got lifelink. When it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice another creature. When you do, destroy target creature an opponent controls, so much like Bone Splinters. And when it dies, return target creature card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this is yet another very, very good Cavalier. Here we have a 5 mana 4/5 with lifelink, probably a C+ or B- on its own. But like all the Cavaliers, he also has an enter the battlefield and death trigger. Being able to Bone Splinter something when he comes down is some nice value to have, though I do kind of wish he could sacrifice himself in a pinch. I don't think I can really complain about this type of efficiency. Sure, sometimes Bone Splinters won't be worth it, but it frequently will be. His death trigger is also nice because it synergizes well with the enter the battlefield trigger. Generally, you'll be sacrificing a little guy, and when this dies, it gets that little guy back from the graveyard, which is pretty great. I think the whole package here makes him a bomb and an easy first pick, even at triple black. I'm giving him an A-. Next up, we have Disfigure, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon instant. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. We've seen this a lot, and it is always good. 1 mana to give something -2/-2 almost always enables you to trade up, and that is always a powerful thing to do. The other thing about this type of effect is that unlike a shock type effect where it just does damage, you can use this to weaken your opponent's creature, and you can block the creature and kill it, while probably keeping your blocker alive too. So in some ways, it's more flexible than damage. This is premium removal, a B-. Next up, we have Dread Presence, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/3 nightmare at rare. Whenever a swamp enters the battlefield under your control, choose 1. You draw a card and you lose 1 life, or Dread Presence deals 2 damage to any target and you gain 2 life. This guy looks great to me. A 4 mana 3/3 is probably a D-, maybe an F these days, but man, the triggered abilities here are incredible. Provided your deck has black as a primary color and you're running like 7 or more swamps, I think this card will be great. If you are monocolored in black, that's possible, it's probably an A+. If black is your primary color, you have 10 or more swamps, then it's probably just an A. I think more often than not, you'll go with the Phyrexian Arena option and draw a card when you play a swamp, but sometimes draining your opponent or killing their creatures will be good too. The one downside this has is that it is horrendous to splash, but that's not much of a downside really. I'm going to give this 2 grades. I think it is first pickable most of the time when you see it no matter what, and going to be very good in any deck that is at least, partially black. So I think I'm going to say it's a B in those decks, and I think if you have 10 or more swamps, it's just a straight up A. I would say that the ideal way to play this, if you can do it, is to wait until you can play a swamp the same turn that you play it, so turn 5. That way, you definitely get value out of it, even if your opponent kills it right away, and you probably get a 2-for-1 one way or another, whether you're killing their smaller creature or drawing a card off of it. Then, if they can't kill it and you keep playing swamps, your opponent's going to rapidly lose the game. Dread Presence is awesome. Looks like one of the more fun cards in the set to play with. I'm really looking forward to playing with it. Definitely first pick it most of the time when you see it. But don't forget, you do need to be playing swamps, so don't try to take it if you think you can splash it. Next up, we have Duress, which for 1 black mana is a sorcery at common. Target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-creature, non-land card from it. That player discards that card. This is like the 1,000,000th time we've seen Duress, and it is basically never worth mainboarding in Limited. Lands and creatures make up something like 80 to 90% of most decks, so you're not going to hit a card with it very often. It is alright sideboard material against people with lots of non-creature spells, but definitely leave it in your sideboard at the start of games anyway. I'm giving it an F, and I think it's a C as a sideboard card. Next up, we have Embodiment of Agonies, which is 1 generic and 2 black for a rare demon with flying and death touch, and it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each different mana cost among non-land cards in your graveyard. So, talk about a weird card, huh? Sort of a weird black Tarmogoyf, but how good is it in Limited? Well, I think pretty solid. So if you just have 1 card in your graveyard when you play this, you're getting a 3 mana 1/1 with death touch and lifelink. That's not too bad. It's not a great stat line, but it is evasive and can trade with anything, and I think that would probably be a C- if this were always a 3 mana 1/1 flying death touch. Once you get 2 or more cards in your graveyard that have different mana costs, he's going to start to look pretty nice. Will you be able to play him on turn 3 in Limited on a regular basis? Probably not, but the keyword abilities mean it will be relevant all game long, provided at least 1 card that's not a land is in your graveyard. And really, playing this as a 2/2 isn't far-fetched at all, and a 3 mana 2/2 with those keywords is probably a B-. Obviously, sometimes it'll just be huge, but yeah, this is a weird one to gauge. But keeping in mind both the huge downside and the huge upside of this card, I think a safe place to put it is around C+. Not being able to play it early is going to suck, and I think that holds it back considerably. There will certainly be times where it just wins games too, of course, but let's go with C+. Next up, we have Epicure of Blood, which for 4 generic and a black is a 4/4 vampire at common, and it says whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. This is a reasonable, though unexciting, payoff for life gain that we saw very recently. As we talked about when looking at white, black-white seems to have some incidental life gain lying around, and there are a few cards that can take advantage of that, with the Epicure being one of them. A 5 mana 4/4 is probably a D, but I think enough black cards are around that gain you life that I think this will be better than that most of the time. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Fathom Fleet Cutthroat, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/3 human pirate at common. When it enters the battlefield, you destroy target creature and opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. This sort of effect almost always seems to underperform, especially on a creature that isn't very efficient to begin with. We did just recently have Vraska's finisher, which was pretty solid, but that's because she could also kill planeswalkers, and there were a ton of them in the set, and she was a 3-mana 3/2, which as a fail case isn't so bad. A 4-mana 3/3 with this effect, and not the ability to destroy planeswalkers, granted there aren't nearly as many of them in this set, but they are around, so having that ability too would be nice. So this just isn't as good as Vraska's finisher. Sure, you can set up situations where you get to kill something with it, but sometimes to do it, you have to give up a creature. The effect is just not always relevant, and your fail case isn't pretty. By the way, I'm not saying this is bad, but I think lots of people vastly overrate a card like this and sort of look at it like it's a ravenous chupacabra, and it just isn't. It's just filler. I'm giving him a C. Next up, we have Feral Abomination, which for 5 generic and a black is a 5/5 common thrall with Death Touch. Another reprint from the relatively recent past. It didn't impress me then, and it doesn't really impress me now. A 6-mana 5/5 is fine, but adding Death Touch to it is not nearly as relevant as you want it to be, since it can already kill lots of creatures thanks to its size. Sure, it is a pain to multi-block and everything, but last time we saw this card, I mostly didn't play it unless I had to because I was desperate for a big boy at the top of the curve, and that makes it a D+. Next up, we have Gorging Vulture, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 bird at common with flying. When it enters the battlefield, you put the top 4 cards of your library into your graveyard. You gain 1 life for each creature card put into your graveyard this way. So this is a Windrake with upside, and that's usually a good place to be. 3-mana 2/2 flyers, again, probably a C- these days. But the fact that Gorging Vulture can both gain you a bit of life and help stock your graveyard, something some of the black decks in this format will certainly care about, means that it's at least solid filler, and I think I'm going to start it at C. Next, we have Gravedigger, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/2 zombie at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This is another card with tons and tons of reprints. It used to be printed at common all the time, and would be one of Black's best commons, so you know this is a very good card. This is good because it's easy to enable a 2-for-1 with it, since it gets you something back from the grave, and has decent enough stats as a 2/2 that it can usually take something down. I think you tend to play at like 4 Gravediggers pretty happily, and I think you first pick it in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Gruesome Scourger, who for 3 generic and 2 black is a 3/3 orc warrior at uncommon. When he enters the battlefield, it deals damage to target opponent or planeswalker equal to the number of creatures you control. So, all alone, this is a 5-mana 3/3 that does 1 damage to an opponent or planeswalker. That would be an F, obviously. If this set had more uncommon planeswalkers, it would be better, but there's only 1 here. How much do you have to do with this before you feel like a 5-mana 3/3 is worth the investment? Probably at least 3, but even then, I'm not like jumping for joy or anything. This can provide some serious reach in the late game, but I feel there are too many situations where casting it just feels bad to want to play it most of the time, and that means it's a D+. Next, we have Knight of the Ebon Legion, which for 1 black is a 1/2 Vampire Knight at rare. It has an activated ability where you can pay 2 generic and a black, and it gets +3/+3 in Death Touch until end of turn. And it says at the beginning of your end step, if a player lost 4 or more life this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Knight of the Ebon Legion. This seems pretty good to me, especially for a 1-drop. Even if it were just a 1/2 with that activated ability, I would think it would be at least a C+. You can play it early, and then in the later part of the game, it is capable of trading with whatever it wants or getting so big that it just wins any combat. Then, if you do enough damage in any way, or your opponent does enough damage to you in any way, he gets bigger. Yeah, I think I'm on board for that. I can definitely see games where this on turn 1 just means you win in limited. This is an excellent 1-drop, something that is usually in incredibly short supply in limited. I think Knight of the Ebon Legion is just a solid B. I think you first pick it most of the time that you see it, and it's going to be a lot of fun to play on turn 1. Next up, we have Legion's End, which for 1 generic and a black is a rare sorcery. It says, exile target creature an opponent controls with converted mana cost 2 or less, and all other creatures that player controls with the same name as that creature. Then that player reveals their hand and exiles all cards with the same name from their hand and graveyard. So let's just look at what this card will do most of the time, and that, in limited anyway, and that's pay 2 mana to get rid of a 2-drop at sorcery speed and let you look at your opponent's hand. I think that card is an okay playable. 2-drops tend to be plentiful enough in most limited formats for that to be the case, and gaining information about your opponent's hand added onto that makes this a C. Now, will there be times when you get to kill 2 creatures with the same name? Probably on rare occasions against tokens that can be particularly good. but I can't give it a grade like that. Will happen more often because it's only going to happen on rare occasions, and yeah, it's just a C. Next up, we have Leyline of the Void, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a rare enchantment. It has the Leyline clause, meaning if it's in your opening hand, you get to start the game with it on the battlefield. And it says if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. Like most of these Leylines, this is horrible and limited. Not enough going on graveyard in this set for this to even be worth siding in most of the time. It's an F. Next up, we have Mind Rot, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says target player discards 2 cards. Black seems like it has more reprints than any other color. We've seen a lot of them already, and this is another one, and it's another underwhelming one. Sure, it gives you a 2-for-1 should you cast it on turn 3, and that feels good, but it becomes so much worse as the game progresses, and honestly, not adding to your board on turn 3 is frequently not worth the 2-for-1. This is mostly sideboard material. You side it in against people who tend to have lots of cards all game long. You can play it in your main board if you're desperate. I think it's a D there, but it's a C out of your sideboard. Next, we have Murder, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a common instant that says destroy target creature. Now, this is an exciting black reprint. In fact, this might just be the best common in the set. 3 mana to destroy anything, no question asked, at instant speed is excellent. The one thing it doesn't have going for it is that it's hard to splash, but that doesn't really matter. This is premium removal all the way and a B+. That makes it better than most rares and mythics in the set. Next up, we have Noxious Grasp, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon instant, and it says, destroy target creature or planeswalker that's green or white, you gain 1 life. Like all of the cards in this cycle of color haters, Noxious Grasp is kind of a weird card to give a grade to. It is an F in your main board, as it will be blank against like 60% of your opponents. However, against someone who is playing green and or white, it's incredible. 2 mana to destroy a creature or planeswalker at instant speed is the kind of efficiency we just don't see. Kind of silly that it has that 1 life clause attached to it, but hey, that is additional value and there are reasons to gain life in this set. So, like I've said with the other parts of this cycle we've already seen, this might be a blank card against some opponents, but against others it will be one of the best cards in your deck. This means this is a B+ as a sideboard card, especially because you're going to encounter people playing 1 or more of those colors in many scenarios. I always like taking these powerful sideboard cards over cards that are below a C+ or so keep that in mind. Next up, we have Rotting Regisaur, who for 2 generic and a black is a 7/6 zombie dinosaur at rare, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, discard a card. So the downside here is very real, but a 3 mana 7/6 is some serious action. Sure, it doesn't have evasion, but the efficiency here just can't be overlooked. Playing it on turn 3 is going to be pretty good just because it's so big, and playing it later in the game is pretty good because, well, it's still pretty big. And you may not even find yourself having to discard to keep it around in the late game. It is a little annoying that this particular clause doesn't say you may discard a card, and if you don't, it has to be sacrificed, because people putting pacifism on something like this is just game over. Anyway, I guess some of that might sound like I'm super high on this card, but I'm not exactly. I mean, I think it definitely has a lot of value. I think you want to play it in most of your black decks, but there are going to be times where it feels horrible. Still, I think it has so much upside that it is a pretty high-quality filler. I think it's C+. Next up, we have Sanitarium Skeleton, which for 1 black is a 1/2 skeleton at common, and you can pay 2 generic and a black to return it from your graveyard to your hand. I'm only ever impressed with this guy when a set is loaded up with graveyard synergy and reasons to discard cards, and while this format has a little bit of that, it isn't loaded with them. Most of the time, he's just going to be a 1 mana 1/2 chump blocker that can come back all the time if you have nothing better to do with your mana. There really aren't even that many good things to sacrifice him to, though we have seen a few of them, but I just don't think any of that's enough to play him most of the time. I'm giving him a D. Next, we have Scheming Symmetry, which for 1 black mana is a rare sorcery. It says choose 2 target players. Each of them searches their library for a card, then shuffles their library and puts that card on top of it. This is a card that is clearly designed for EDH. Tutor effects are cool and all, but letting your opponent also get the best or most useful card out of their deck, that's not so good. Even if this let both players put the card immediately in their hand, I don't think Scheming Symmetry would be that good, but the fact that it only puts them on top, which means that your opponent gets to use the card they grabbed first, makes this utterly unplayable. The one situation where this would become good is probably if you were going to play a 2-headed giant draft or sealed at your pre-release, in which case you can target you and your partner with it, which is kind of hilarious, instead of you and your opponent. But All other cases, it's a complete dud and an F, the kind of rare you should be ready to see left in packs for your 14th or 15th picks. Next up, we have Sorcerer of the Fang, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/3 human wizard at common, and for 5 generic and a black, you can tap it, and it deals 2 damage to target opponent or planeswalker. So a 2 mana 1/3 is a D- or a D. One with this ability is better since it has some late game relevance, but I would much rather have a 2 mana 2/2 or 2/1 with an ability relevant in the late game, as those can trade and attack much better. So this ability is expensive, the creature it's on isn't impressive. I don't think I want to play this unless I really need 2 drops. I'm giving it a D. So next is Sorin, Imperious Bloodlord, who for 2 generic and a black is a legendary planeswalker Sorin at Mythic Rare. Told you we'd see him eventually. He has a +1. Oh, he also starts with 4 loyalty. And he has a +1 that says, target creature you control gains Death Touch and Lifelink until end of turn. If it's a vampire, put a +1/+1 counter on it. He has another +1 that says you may sacrifice a vampire. When you do, Sorin deals 3 damage to any target and you gain 3 life. And he has a -3 that says you may put a vampire creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. So this Sorin kind of reminds me of the last core set Liliana, who was a zombie build around in a format that didn't have enough zombies. The good news about Sorin is both that they think there are enough vampires in this set that he's easier to build around, and he has an ability that actually does something even if the creature is not a vampire. His +1's still kind of useful, giving something lifelink and death touch. Not terrible, so he does do something useful even in the absence of vampires. Because of that, I think your average black deck's going to have like 2 or 3 vampires in it, and I think in your typical black deck, he's going to be a C- if that's what you have going on. Now, if you are able to build around him and get 5, 6, 7 or more vampires, he's going to get increasingly strong. Sacrificing a vampire to Lightning Helix a creature or your opponent is great. Playing a vampire for free might even be good. I think I'm going to give him that build-around grade where he's a C- in your typical black deck in the format and a B- in a deck that really gets there on vampires. I'm not going to go higher on his top grade just because I think it's going to be difficult to end up with like a tribal vampire deck where you have like 10 of them, in which case he would be like an A-, but I just don't see that happening often enough for it to be worth it. But he is an interesting card. It will be interesting to see if he pans out or doesn't pan out like Liliana did in the last core set, and she certainly did not. I do think he's better than her, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. Next up, we have Soul Salvage, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. I always like blacks, commons like this that let you return 2 creatures to your hand for 3 mana. This effect is something you basically always want one of in your black decks, but usually not more than one. This is because this kind of card is useless in the early game, really only useful in the late game, when it will always give you a 2-for-1 and give you some gas when you're running out of it. I don't recommend taking this early, as one will almost always wheel if you want one. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Thought Distortion, which for 4 generic and 2 black is an uncommon sorcery. It can't be countered, and it says target opponent reveals their hand. Exile all non-creature, non-land cards from that player's hand and graveyard. This looks pretty horrible and limited. 6 mana is a ton, and if you're spending that much, you want to be actually accomplishing something. By that late in the game, there is no guarantee your opponent will even have a hand, and only exiling non-creature, non-land cards from their graveyard isn't worth 6 mana at all. I can't imagine the format having enough control or graveyard-based decks for this to ever be worth playing. It's an F. Next up, we have Undead Servant, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/2 common. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token for each card named Undead Servant in your graveyard. This is the black card in this set cycle of collect 'em all commons, and it is a reprint of one we saw back in Magic Origins. I wasn't ultra impressed there, but it was a format that was fast enough that setting this up wasn't the easiest. Obviously, like all the cards in this cycle, playing only one is pretty terrible, a straight up F. You don't want to be playing a vanilla 4 mana 3/2. There are countless cards in this set that you would play before that. You have to be making a zombie token pretty regularly with these for them to be worth it. How many copies of this do you need before it's worth playing? Probably around 3, and it gets better if you were good at loading up your graveyard and you can get value out of them that way. Still, I don't think this one has a high cap. I think he really caps out around C with 4 or so copies. It's just too much of a liability if you can't consistently get zombie tokens. Next up, we have Unholy Indenture, which for 2 generic and a black is a common aura. It has enchant creature. When that creature dies, you return it to the battlefield under your control with a +1/+1 counter on it. I don't think this is good at all. You have to play around your opponent's removal when you play it or risk an ugly 2-for-1, and the payoff really isn't worth it. If maybe you have a bunch of into the battlefield creatures or something, maybe it gets to be worth it. But I just don't see this synergizing especially well with anything that's going on in this set, and I think that makes it an F. Next, we have Vampire of the Dire Moon, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 vampire at uncommon with Death Touch and Lifelink. I am pretty much always happy with 1 mana 1/1 Death Touchers. They are great in more defensive decks because they can trade for anything. Adding Lifelink here is a nice touch because sometimes you'll have to go on the offensive with this and force your opponent to choose between trading a big creature for it or just taking it. And now just taking it has some other extra consequences because you get to gain a little bit of life. Still, while this card is efficient at what it does, like most 1/1 Death Touchers, it isn't like it's game-breaking, but it's a nice card. One you're generally happy to play multiples of. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Vengeful War Chief, who for 4 generic and a black is a 4/4 Orc Warrior at uncommon, and whenever you lose life for the first time each turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on him. 5 mana 4/4s aren't good, but this guy is basically guaranteed to get larger if he sticks around. Your opponent will damage you, maybe you're going to damage yourself, and once that starts happening, you're kind of in business. He seems like a great card to help you win a long game as he gets progressively larger. I think you are happy playing one of these in most black decks, but he isn't super impactful, at least not impactful enough to go after super early. I'm giving him a C+. Next up, we have Villus, Broker of Blood, who for 5 generic and 3 black is an 8/8 legendary demon at rare. He's got flying. He has an activated ability where you pay 1 black and 2 life, and target creature gets -1/-1 till end of turn. And he also says, whenever you lose life, draw that many cards. So there's a cycle in this set of legendary rares with triple colored mana costs. This is the black one. He costs 8. He's the most expensive in the cycle. But he does do what an 8 mana creature should do. He's going to win you the game if you're allowed to untap. He is a huge evasive creature, so he gives you a very good win condition. But if you're in a situation where you can't really attack with him, well, he can still help you out. If your opponent damages you, you get to draw a card for each damage, a good way to help you find a way to become the aggressor. And of course, his activated ability basically reads, pay 1 black mana and 2 life, draw 2 cards and give a creature -1/-1 until end of turn, which is absurd. Now, if you're super low on life, he may not help you a ton, but at least he's still a huge roadblock. All that said, he is 8 mana, and 8 mana is kind of where you're getting into the territory where, like, you know, how often am I going to actually be able to play this card? And the answer is probably not all that frequently, and for that reason, he's hard to really prioritize, even though in a vacuum, he's incredibly powerful. I think you should try to play him if you get him, because he's just that good, but I don't think I can give him more than a C. Next up, we have Yarok's Fen Liarer, which is 2 black mana for a 1/1 horror at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent exiles a card from their hand, and he has an activated ability. You can pay 2 generic and a black, and it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. I always feel alright about playing a Ravenous Rats or 2 in my limited deck, and that's basically what this is. While it is harder to cast, it also makes the opponent exile the card, and it can pump itself late. Now, that pump effect is expensive, and I don't think you should ever play this and count on it being able to be huge, but sometimes games are going to happen where you and your opponent are just flooding out, and suddenly all you can do is attack with your Fen Liarer with all your mana, and he's going to be pretty good in those board stall situations because he can just get so huge. But he's nothing special. I think he's just a solid C. Well, those are my thoughts about every black card in Core Set 2020. I'll be back tomorrow to talk about all the red cards in the set. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review, as well as Core Set 2020 draft videos coming in the near future, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're looking for the playlist that has all the videos in this set review, or will by the end of the week, you should see it on your screen now. Thanks for watching.